Hello, and in this video we're going to continue our discussion about asymptotes. In the last video we talked about vertical asymptotes. In this video we're going to talk about horizontal asymptotes. There are two different types of horizontal asymptotes, and we determine those by two different ways. So if you have a horizontal asymptote at y equals 0, here, then that just means that the degree of the p function is less than the degree of q. So remember, our rational function was r of x equals p of x over q of x. So what we're saying here is we're always going to get a horizontal one at y equals 0 if the degree on the top one is less than the degree of the bottom one. And I've given you several examples here that have a horizontal asymptote at y equals 0. Here we got x squared on the bottom and no x's, so that's definitely got a bigger power on the bottom. The degree on the top is less. Here we have a power of 1. That's definitely bigger than this one. Here we have a power of 2, and this is a power of 1. Here we have a power of 4, and that's a power of 3. Therefore, the top one is less than the bottom one. So any of those have a degree or have a horizontal asymptote of y equals 0. Now, the other horizontal asymptote can happen when we have a function that has the same leading powers. So like in this case, I have a 2x over an x. They have the same leading powers of x to the first. And in that case, we would divide those two leading powers, 2x over x, to get the horizontal asymptote of 2. So y equals 2 is the horizontal asymptote of this function. Sorry, let's continue on now. A horizontal asymptote at y equals n happens when we divide the highest powers of each, the denominator and the numerator, but they have to be the same. So we look at this power, we have a power of 1 here in the numerator, we have a power of 1 in the denominator. These are the same. It has a horizontal asymptote. In order to find the horizontal asymptote, we would take that term, 3x, over the term on the bottom, which is negative 4x, and we would divide those two and get negative 3/4. So this gives us an answer of y equals negative 3/4 as a horizontal asymptote for that first example. Alright, now on my second example right here, our powers are 2. There's a squared here and a square here. So we would divide those two terms, x squared over 5x squared. And that reduces down to 1/5. So my asymptote there is going to be y equals 1/5 for that function. Now we can also look at a vertical asymptote here. There probably are vertical asymptotes because that's when the denominator equals 0. So we can also have vertical asymptotes as well. Now this one has the same term twice, same lead term twice. So that's just going to be x cubed over x cubed, which is going to be 1. So that's going to be y equals 1 for this horizontal asymptote. So those are with the powers that are the same. So let's look at the three examples we did earlier in a previous video. We looked at this one and we looked at where the vertical asymptotes were. So in the same situation, we're going to look for horizontal asymptotes here. So here's our highest exponents. Since this one's less here, this is going to have a horizontal asymptote at y equals 0 because this one's less than this one. Okay? Now, moving on to our second example. This example also follows the same pattern. We have this one being less. Then that's going to also be y equals 0 for a horizontal asymptote. And before, remember before we had x squared minus 4 equals 0. So that means we had vertical asymptotes at 2 and x equals negative 2. So this was horizontal right here, and these were vertical. So in graphing this, these are helpful so that we know how that graph looks. Now let's look at this last one. Oh, we did factor this. Now these are the same. Highest powers are the same. That means we would divide those two highest powers. The highest power being x squared over x squared. We divide those two terms with the highest exponents on them and we get 1. So y equals 1 is our horizontal asymptote. So there are two different ways to get a horizontal asymptote. There are two different ways. If the power on the top is less, then it's y equals 0. If the powers are equal, then we divide them to get the actual number for the horizontal asymptote.